The winter wind howled through the wooden planks of the small ranch house, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Clara Bennett pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stirred the pot of beans on the cast-iron stove. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the sparse kitchen, but it couldn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with Wyoming's harsh winter. It had been 2 years since John died. 2 years since that terrible morning when his horse returned to the ranch without him, its saddle askew and reins dragging in the mud. She'd found him 3 miles out, crushed beneath a fallen tree after what the sheriff called an unfortunate accident during the cattle drive. Clara knew better. John had been too careful a rider, too experienced with the land. But proving anything against the powerful men who wanted their little piece of paradise was another matter entirely. She moved to the frost-covered window, using her sleeve to clear a small circle in the condensation. The view hadn't changed. Rolling hills blanketed in snow, the barn standing sturdy against the elements, and beyond that, the endless Wyoming sky, gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. This land was all she had left of John, all she had, period. 160 acres of prime grazing land with good water access, a prize many would kill for. And some probably had. Clara's jaw tightened as she thought of Maxwell Pierce's latest visit just last week. The wealthy rancher had arrived in his fancy carriage, flanked by 2 hired guns who stayed mounted, their hands never far from their pistols. Pierce had smiled that snake smile of his, tipping his expensive hat as if he were a gentleman caller rather than a vulture circling dying prey. "Mrs. Bennett," he'd said, his voice smooth as oil. "I do hope you've reconsidered my generous offer. A woman alone out here. Well, it's just not safe. Not proper, either. Why, just last month, the Andersons had that terrible fire, lost everything." His eyes had glinted with something that made Clara's skin crawl. Accidents happen so easily out here. She'd stood on her porch, John's old rifle hidden just inside the door, and told Pierce exactly where he could put his offer. The memory of his face, the flash of anger quickly masked by that false smile, still made her hands shake. He'd left with a warning disguised as concern. "Winter's coming on hard. Mrs. Bennett, a widow needs protection. Don't wait too long to accept help when it's offered." Clara abandoned the window and returned to her beans, adding a precious piece of salt pork from her dwindling stores. She needed to make it last. The nearest town was a day's ride in good weather. Impossible now with the storms. She'd learned to stretch everything: food, firewood, lamp oil. John had always said she was tougher than any man he knew, but he'd never intended for her to face these Wyoming winters alone. The loneliness was the hardest part, not the work. She'd grown up on a ranch and knew how to mend fences, tend cattle, and shoot straight. But the silence, broken only by wind and her own breathing, sometimes threatened to drive her mad. She found herself talking to John's memory, to the horses, even to the stubborn milk cow just to hear a voice, even if it was her own. "You always said I was too stubborn for my own good," she murmured to the empty room, picturing John's laughing face. He'd been a good man, gentle despite his calloused hands, with a smile that could coax her out of her darkest moods. They'd built this place together, board by board, dream by dream. 3 years of marriage, not nearly enough. She ladled beans onto a chipped plate and sat at the rough-hewn table John had made their first winter. Her fingers traced the initials he'd carved into the corner. JB plus CB, surrounded by a lopsided heart. Such a romantic gesture from a man who'd blushed just asking her to dance at the harvest social. The wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Clara glanced toward the door, checking that the bar was in place. Living alone had made her cautious. She kept John's pistol on the table beside her bed, his rifle by the door, and had learned to sleep light, waking at any unusual sound. The law was a day's ride away, and even then, Sheriff Wallace seemed more interested in keeping the peace with wealthy ranchers than protecting widows. After supper, Clara banked the fire and prepared for bed. She paused at her dresser, opening the small wooden box that held her few treasures. John's pocket watch, still keeping perfect time, the photograph from their wedding day, both of them looking so young and hopeful, a lock of his dark hair tied with ribbon, and her wedding ring. She still wore it, despite what the townswomen whispered about her needing to move on and find another husband. "Let them talk," she said to John's photograph. "I made promises to you, and I aim to keep them. This land is ours, and I'll not let Pierce or anyone else steal it away." She pulled on her warmest nightgown and crawled beneath the pile of quilts, her breath misting in the cold air. Tomorrow would bring more chores, checking on the cattle in the lower pasture, breaking ice on the water troughs, reinforcing the barn door that had been creaking ominously. An endless cycle of work that would have been manageable with two but felt overwhelming alone. As sleep began to claim her, Clara's last thought was a prayer, not for an easier life or even for companionship, but simply for the strength to make it through another winter. She'd survived two already. She could survive this one. She had to. This land was John's legacy, and she'd defend it with her last breath if necessary. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending snow swirling against the windows and wind shrieking through the gaps in the walls. But inside her small ranch house, Clara Bennett slept on, unaware that by tomorrow night, her carefully maintained solitude would be shattered, and the simple, lonely life she'd built would be forever changed. In the darkness, snow began to pile against the door, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed across the empty prairie like a harbinger of the chaos to come. The blizzard struck with a fury that even seasoned Wyoming folk would call uncommonly fierce. Clara woke to find her windows completely obscured by snow, the howling wind so loud it drowned out all other sounds. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, layering on every warm garment she owned, and ventured out to check on the animals. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. She fought her way to the barn, barely able to see 3 feet ahead through the swirling white. The horses nickered nervously as she entered, and she spent precious time calming them, checking their water hadn't frozen solid overnight. It was on her way back to the house that she saw it, a dark shape against the white snow near her porch steps. At first, she thought it might be a fallen branch or debris blown by the storm, but as she drew closer, her heart began to pound. It was a man, face down in the snow, his expensive wool coat already half buried by the relentless snowfall. Clara's first instinct was to reach for the pistol she kept tucked in her coat. Could this be one of Pierce's men, sent to frighten her? But as she circled the still form cautiously, she noticed the dark stain spreading beneath him, turning the pristine snow a sickening crimson. "Mister," she called out, prodding him with her boot. No response. Against her better judgment, she knelt and rolled him over, gasping at what she saw. This was no ordinary cowhand or hired gun. Everything about him screamed wealth, from his fine leather boots to the gold watch chain visible beneath his coat. His face, though deathly pale and streaked with blood from a gash on his temple, had the refined features of a man who'd never known hard labor. More disturbing still was the bullet wound in his shoulder, still seeping blood through his expensive shirt. Someone had shot this man. And recently? Clara glanced around nervously, but the blizzard had erased any tracks. Whoever had done this was long gone, leaving their victim to die in the storm. She should leave him. Every practical bone in her body screamed it. A strange man, obviously wealthy, shot and left on her property. This had trouble written all over it. But as she started to rise, he moaned softly, his eyelids fluttering. Still alive, then, barely. Clara closed her eyes. Fighting an internal war. The code of the frontier demanded hospitality to those in need. It was a matter of survival in these harsh lands. But she was a widow, alone, and bringing a man into her home would set every gossip's tongue wagging from here to Cheyenne. The unwritten rules were clear. A respectable woman didn't harbor strange men, no matter the circumstances. Another moan, weaker this time. His lips were already turning blue from the cold. If she left him here, he'd be dead within the hour. Clara made her decision, though she suspected she'd regret it. "Lord, forgive me for what I'm about to do," she muttered, grabbing the man under his arms. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight in her grip. It took all her strength to drag him up the porch steps and through her door, leaving a trail of blood and snow across her clean floors. She deposited him near the stove and hurried to stoke the fire higher. In the better light of her kitchen, she could see him more clearly. Definitely wealthy. His clothes alone probably cost more than her ranch made in a year. Dark hair, well-groomed despite his current state, and hands that had never held a branding iron or mended a fence. The bullet wound was her first priority. Clara had doctored plenty of injuries on the ranch, but this was beyond her usual cuts and bruises. She fetched John's whiskey, kept for medicinal purposes. He'd always claimed with a wink, and her sewing kit. The bullet had passed clean through. Thank the Lord, but the wound was ugly and needed cleaning. As she cut away his shirt, she noticed other things. A leather portfolio tucked inside his coat, papers spilling out, a Derringer pistol in a concealed holster, a gentleman's weapon, not a fighter's, and pinned inside his coat, a calling card that made her freeze. Nathaniel Harlow, First Bank of Cheyenne. Harlow. She knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. The Harlow family owned the largest bank in the territory, holding mortgages on half the ranches around. They were known for their ruthless business practices, foreclosing without mercy when payments came up short. How many families had been ruined by Harlow banknotes? Clara's hands trembled as she cleaned the wound. What in God's name was Nathaniel Harlow doing out here in a blizzard? Shot and dying? Nothing good, that was certain. She should throw him back into the storm. Let nature take its course. How many widows and orphans had his family created with their greed? But her hands kept working, cleaning and stitching with practiced efficiency. Whatever else she was, Clara Bennett was no murderer. She'd patch him up, and when the storm broke, she'd send him on his way. Simple as that. She'd just finished bandaging the wound when she noticed the leather portfolio had fallen open, revealing its contents. Despite herself, Clara glanced at the visible pages. What she saw made her blood run cold. Names and figures, column after column. The Andersons, foreclosed. The Millers, payment due. The Bennetts. Her own name jumped out at her. There, in neat handwriting, was a notation. Bennett Ranch, 160 acres, prime location, widow resistant to sale. MP suggests alternative pressure. Accident arranged? Outstanding note can be called in if... The entry was unfinished, but Clara didn't need to read more. MP Maxwell Pierce, an accident arranged, just like John's accident. Her hands clenched into fists as rage flooded through her. They'd killed John. These bastards had murdered her husband for their land grab, and now they had the audacity to send one of their own to her door? She stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. The smart thing would be to let him die. Who would know? She could drag his body out after the storm, claim she found him frozen. Justice for John, in a way. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't. She wasn't a killer, no matter how much they deserved it. Besides, alive. Nathaniel Harlow might be useful. That portfolio contained evidence of their schemes, maybe enough to bring them down legally, to save other families from what she'd suffered. Clara forced herself to calm down, to think clearly. First things first, she needed to get him warm and stable. Then she'd figure out what to do with him. She dragged John's old cot from the storage room, setting it up near the stove. Moving Harlow onto it nearly broke her back, but she managed. She was just covering him with blankets when his eyes opened. unfocused and fever-bright. He stared at her without recognition, then tried to sit up, gasping in pain. "Easy," Clara said, pushing him back down. "You've been shot. You're safe now." "Shot," he mumbled, his voice cultured even in delirium. "Pierce tried to... the documents." Clara's breath caught. "Pierce shot you." But he was already fading again, muttering incoherently about betrayal and stolen funds. Within moments, he was unconscious again, leaving Clara with more questions than answers. She sat back on her heels, studying her unwelcome guest. Whatever game was being played here, she was now in the middle of it. Nathaniel Harlow, son of the most powerful banker in the territory, shot by Maxwell Pierce and left to die at her door. The same Maxwell Pierce who wanted her land, who might have killed her husband. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing them in together. Clara touched her wedding ring, a habit when she needed strength. "Well, John," she whispered, "I hope you're watching over me, because I have a feeling I'm going to need all the help I can get." She settled into her rocking chair with John's rifle across her lap, prepared for a long vigil. Whatever tomorrow brought, she'd be ready for it. The wolves of Wyoming came in many forms, and Clara Bennett had learned to face them all. The fever took hold of Nathaniel Harlow that first night, turning him into a stranger who thrashed and muttered secrets in his delirium. Clara found herself playing reluctant nurse, bathing his burning forehead with cool cloths and forcing water between his cracked lips. She should have been repulsed by tending to a Harlow, but illness had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only vulnerable humanity behind. During the long hours of that storm-locked night, she had ample time to examine the contents of his leather portfolio. What she found there made her hands shake with barely controlled fury. The ledger was more than just a record of debts. It was a blueprint for systematic theft on a grand scale. Page after page revealed the conspiracy between the Harlow Bank and Maxwell Pierce. Loans were given with impossible terms, hidden clauses that allowed the bank to call in the full amount with a peanuts 30 days' notice. When families couldn't pay, and they were designed to ensure families couldn't pay, Pierce would swoop in to buy the land at a fraction of its value. The bank got its money, Pierce got the land, and families were left with nothing. The Johnsons, forced out after their crop failed. The Weatherbys, whose medical bills after little Sarah's illness made them miss one payment. The O'Briens, the Kowalskis, the Changs. Every family had a story of tragedy exploited for profit. And there, among them all, was her own name. Clara read her entry with trembling fingers. Bennett Ranch, John Bennett, deceased, arranged by MP, made to look accidental. Widow Clara Bennett refuses all offers. MP suggests increasing pressure. Note: original loan documents may have been altered to show larger amount owed. If widow can be compromised, found with man. Forced marriage could transfer property rights. Alternative: call-in note. Force foreclosure. The words blurred as tears of rage filled her eyes. Arranged. John's death had been arranged like a business transaction. She'd suspected. But seeing it confirmed in their own handwriting was like being shot herself. Her gentle John, who'd never harmed anyone. Murdered for profit. A groan from the cot drew her attention. Harlow was stirring, his fever finally breaking. She quickly closed the ledger and tucked it away, schooling her features to neutrality. When his eyes opened, they were clearer than they'd been since she'd found him. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're safe," Clara said stiffly, though the word safe nearly choked her. "You were shot. I found you in the storm." He tried to sit up, gasped at the pain in his shoulder, and fell back. His eyes, an unsettling pale blue, focused on her face with surprising intensity. I don't know you." "Clara Bennett, this is my ranch." She saw the recognition flicker across his features. "Bennett, the widow Pierce mentioned." "Yes?" The word came out harder than she intended. The one who won't sell? Something in her tone must have warned him, because wariness crept into his expression. He glanced around the modest cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the rifle within easy reach, the way she sat just far enough away to be out of grabbing distance. You know who I am. It wasn't a question. Nathaniel Harlow. Your cards were in your coat. She didn't mention the ledger. Not yet. He closed his eyes briefly. Then you know you're harboring a dangerous guest. Mrs. Bennett. Pierce won't be happy I survived. Why did he shoot you? Harlow's laugh was bitter. Because I grew a conscience. Apparently a fatal flaw in our business. He studied her with those unsettling eyes. I discovered what he'd been doing. The land scheme, the forced foreclosures, the accidents. I confronted him privately. Threatened to expose everything if he didn't stop. He suggested we discuss it over drinks at the saloon. I was fool enough to trust him. Clara's skepticism must have shown, because he continued. You don't believe me. Why would you? My family name is mud among the ranchers here, and deservedly so. My father built his empire on others' misfortunes. I was content to look the other way, to enjoy the profits without questioning the methods. Until... He trailed off, wincing as he shifted position. Until what? Clara prompted despite herself. Until I watched Sam O'Brien cry in my office, begging for just one more month to save his family's homestead. His wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with 3 young children. 1 month, that's all he needed. But the terms were ironclad, and my father insisted on foreclosure. His voice turned savage. Do you know what my father said? Business is business. Nathaniel, sentiment is for the weak. Clara remained silent, fighting the unwanted spark of sympathy his words ignited. This could all be an act, a Harlow trying to save his own skin. I gave O'Brien the month, Harlow continued. Paid it from my own pocket without telling my father. Started looking into other accounts, seeing how deep the rot went. That's when I found Pierce's arrangement with the bank, the bribes, the altered documents, the murders made to look like accidents. He turned his head to look at her directly. Your husband's name was on that list. Mrs. Bennett. I'm sorry. The simple words, spoken with what seemed like genuine regret, nearly undid her. Clara stood abruptly, needing distance. Sorry doesn't bring him back, Mr. Harlow. Sorry doesn't undo what your family helped orchestrate. No, he agreed quietly. It doesn't. She busied herself at the stove, adding wood with unnecessary force. Why should I believe anything you say? For all I know, this is another scheme. Get the widow to trust you. Compromise her reputation. Force her to sell. Because Pierce shot me and left me to die in a blizzard, Harlow suggested dryly. Rather extreme for a confidence game, don't you think? He had a point, though Clara was loath to admit it. She'd seen the blood. The way he'd been dumped without care. No one would risk their life that way for a land grab. Besides, he added, you've read the ledger, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes. You know what's in there. Clara spun to face him. How? It was tucked in my coat. You're too intelligent to not have looked. He attempted what might have been a self-deprecating smile. Rather damning evidence to leave lying around if I were trying to deceive you. Maybe you didn't expect to survive. Clara shot back. Maybe I didn't. The admission hung heavy between them. When Pierce raised that gun, I thought of all the families we'd destroyed, all the lives ruined for profit. I thought perhaps it was justice. Self-pity doesn't suit you, Mr. Harlow. No, I suppose it doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. What will you do now? You have evidence of crimes that could bring down Pierce and expose my father's bank. You could take it to the authorities. Clara laughed bitterly. Which authorities? Sheriff Wallace. Who takes his orders from Pierce? Judge Morrison. Who owns shares in your father's bank? There is no law here except what the powerful make for themselves. Then we're both trapped, Harlow said softly. You by conscience and circumstance, me by my own foolish attempt at redemption. The wind had finally begun to die down outside, the worst of the storm passing. Soon the roads would be passable, and word would spread that she had a man in her cabin. Clara touched her wedding ring, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "There's one more thing," Harlow said, his voice growing weaker as exhaustion pulled at him. "Pierce mentioned something before he shot me. Said he had plans for the Bennett widow, that by week's end, you'd either be married to one of his men or run out of the territory in shame. I think my arrival here wasn't entirely accidental." Clara's blood ran cold. Of course, Pierce was cunning enough to use even this, shoot Harlow near her property, knowing her conscience wouldn't let her leave him to die. And once word got out that she'd harbored a man. "Rest," she told Harlow curtly. "You'll need your strength for what's coming." As he drifted back to sleep, Clara sat at her table with the damning ledger before her. The evidence of crimes filled page after page, but evidence meant nothing without power to enforce justice. She was one woman, alone, with wolves circling ever closer. But she'd be damned if she'd make it easy for them. Whatever Pierce had planned, whatever trap he'd set, Clara Bennett would meet it head-on. She'd survived 2 years of widowhood in this harsh land. She'd survive this too. The storm was breaking, and with it would come the vultures. Let them come. She'd be ready. The news traveled faster than Clara had anticipated. By the second morning after the storm, she spotted riders on the horizon, 3 figures moving purposefully toward her ranch. She recognized Sheriff Wallace's distinctive gray hat even at a distance. Her stomach knotted as she quickly checked on Harlow, who was finally sitting up and taking broth, though still weak as a newborn calf. "Company's coming," she told him tersely. "The sheriff and others." His face, already pale from blood loss, went a shade whiter. "Pierce's men." "Likely." Clara moved to the window, studying the approaching riders. "Sheriff Wallace, Reverend Mitchell, and Thomas Brennan from the town council." "An official delegation," Harlow observed grimly. "They're not wasting time." Clara had barely managed to hide the ledger and tidy the main room when the knock came. Authoritative, demanding. She smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. "Sheriff Wallace." She nodded to each man in turn. "Reverend Mr. Brennan, what brings you out in this weather?" Sheriff Wallace, a man who'd grown soft and prosperous in Pierce's pocket, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mrs. Bennett, we've had reports of concerning activity at your ranch. Word is you've got a man staying here." "Reports travel remarkably fast," Clara said evenly, "especially considering the roads have been impassable for 2 days." The Reverend, a thin man with a pinched look of perpetual disapproval, stepped forward. "Mrs. Bennett, surely you understand the gravity of the situation. A widow, alone, harboring a man. It's unseemly, scandalous even." "I found an injured man in the storm," Clara replied. "Would you have had me leave him to freeze to death, Reverend? I seem to recall something in Scripture about good Samaritans." Brennan, who owned the general store and had the gossipy nature to match, craned his neck trying to see past her. "Is it true it's the Harlow boy? What's he doing way out here?" "That's a question for Mr. Harlow when he's recovered enough to answer." Clara said firmly, "Now, if you gentlemen have said your piece—" "Not so fast." Sheriff Wallace's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a gesture meant to intimidate. "There are laws about propriety, Mrs. Bennett, unwritten laws. Maybe, but laws all the same. A respectable woman doesn't keep male company without proper chaperonage or marriage." Clara felt her temper rising. "And what would you have me do? Sheriff, cast out an injured man to die? That would be murder." "Should have thought of that before you brought him inside." Wallace replied smugly. "Actions have consequences. The town council met this morning. Special session. Either you marry the man, proper and legal, or you both leave the territory." Can't have such scandalous behavior corrupting our community." "Corrupting?" Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "What's corrupting is men like Maxwell Pierce stealing land from honest folk. What's corrupting is officials who look the other way when accidents happen to anyone who won't sell." Wallace's face darkened. "That's dangerous talk. Mrs. Bennett, slanderous, even Mr. Pierce is a respected member of our community." "Respected by those he pays," Clara shot back. Reverend Mitchell raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Please, let's remain civil. Mrs. Bennett, the solution is simple. Marry Mr. Harlow. It would restore your reputation and resolve this unfortunate situation." "I buried my husband 2 years ago," Clara said, her voice deadly quiet. "I won't dishonor his memory with a forced marriage to satisfy your hypocritical propriety." "Then you'll leave," Brennan said, almost gleefully. Clara had refused his son's courtship last year, and he'd never forgiven the slight. "Both of you, by week's end." "This is my land," Clara stated flatly. "Bought and paid for. You have no legal right." "Legal right?" Wallace laughed unpleasantly. "Mrs. Bennett, possession is 9/10 of the law out here, and if the community decides you're no longer welcome, well, things can get mighty uncomfortable for those who don't belong." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Clara knew what he meant. Mysterious fires, poisoned wells, killed livestock, all the ways a community could force out those deemed undesirable. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have 2 days," Wallace declared. "Either post marriage bans with the Reverend here, or start packing. Choice is yours." After they left, Clara sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. From the cot, Harlow watched her with those unsettling pale eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This is my fault. Pierce knew exactly what would happen if I was found here." "Save your apologies," Clara snapped. "They're as useless as—" She stopped, pressing her palms against her eyes. 2 days. How am I supposed to make such a choice in 2 days? "There is another option," Harlow said carefully. "I could leave tonight, disappear. Without me here, they have no grounds." "You can barely stand," Clara interrupted. "You wouldn't make it a mile in this cold. Besides, Pierce is probably watching the roads, waiting for you to try exactly that." She rose and paced to the window, staring out at the land she and John had worked so hard to build. Every fence post, every building, every improvement held memories. How could she leave? But how could she marry a stranger? Worse, a Harlow? "What will you do?" Harlow asked softly. Clara turned to face him, her chin raised defiantly. "I don't know yet, but I won't be driven from my land by fear or false propriety." That afternoon, word of the ultimatum spread like wildfire. Clara had 3 visitors in quick succession, each more uncomfortable than the last. First came Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the judge's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of the community. She swept in wearing enough fabric to make 3 sensible dresses, her nose wrinkled as if she smelled something foul. "My dear Mrs. Bennett," she began, settling herself uninvited at Clara's table. "I've come to offer guidance in your time of difficulty." "How kind," Clara said dryly, not offering coffee. "Marriage to Mr. Harlow would solve everything," Adelaide continued, ignoring Clara's tone. "He's from a good family, wealthy, established. Many women would consider themselves fortunate." "His family's wealth comes from destroying others," Clara interrupted. "Forgive me if I don't swoon at the prospect." Adelaide's eyes narrowed. "Pride goes before a fall. Mrs. Bennett, a wise woman, knows when to compromise. And a fool compromises her principles for comfort," Clara retorted. Adelaide left in a huff, but she was quickly followed by Doc Jameson, one of the few people Clara actually respected. The elderly physician examined Harlow's wound, pronouncing it healing well. then pulled Clara aside. "Clara, girl, I delivered you into this world," he said gently. "Your PA was my friend. So let me speak plain. This is a battle you can't win. Pierce has the sheriff, the judge, most of the town council. Fighting them will only bring you grief." "So I should surrender? Marry a man I don't know to appease their hypocritical morality?" Doc Jameson sighed. "Sometimes surviving means bending so you don't break. Your John would understand that." The last visitor was the most surprising. Mary O'Brien, widow of the man Harlow had claimed to help. She stood on Clara's porch, thin and worn, her children huddled behind her skirts. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "Is Nathaniel Harlow here?" "Yes," Clara admitted, wondering if she faced another condemnation. But Mary's eyes filled with tears. "He saved us," she whispered. "That month he gave us, Sam managed to sell enough cattle to pay off the loan. We kept our home because of him." She grabbed Clara's hands. "Whatever folks say about the Harlows, that one's different. He's got a heart in him." After Mary left, Clara found herself more confused than ever. The man lying on her cot was a puzzle, a Harlow who'd grown a conscience, a wealthy man who'd risked everything to expose corruption. Could she trust him? Could she afford not to? As evening fell, casting long shadows across the snow, Clara made her decision. She wouldn't run. This was her land, bought with sweat and love and loss, but marriage, that was another cage, another kind of surrender. There had to be another way. There had to be. But as she looked out at the darkening sky, she couldn't see it. The wolves were circling, and she was running out of time. The morning of the second day dawned clear and bitter cold. Clara had spent a sleepless night wrestling with her choices, each option more unpalatable than the last. She found Harlow attempting to dress himself, his face tight with pain as he struggled with his shirt. "You're in no condition to travel," she said flatly. "I won't be the cause of you losing your home," he replied, jaws set with determination. "I'll make it to town. Tell them I forced my way in, that you had no choice." "Stop!" Clara's voice was weary. "We both know that won't work. Pierce has painted his picture too well. The righteous citizens of Willow Creek have made up their minds." She helped him with his shirt, trying not to notice the way he winced. In 2 days of forced proximity, she'd learned things about Nathaniel Harlow that didn't fit the image she'd carried of his family. He thanked her for every small kindness. He spoke of books and ideas with a passion that reminded her of John's quiet intellectualism. Most surprisingly, he listened, really listened, when she talked about the ranch, her plans for it, her memories. "There is one solution," Harlow said quietly. "We marry, as they demand, but only as a business arrangement. Once the immediate danger passes, we could seek an annulment or divorce. Eastern lawyers know ways around these things." Clara's hand stilled. "You'd do that? Bind yourself to a woman you don't know, risk your reputation, your family's anger?" "My reputation is already in tatters after confronting Pierce. As for my family," his smile was bitter. "My father disowned me the moment I started questioning his methods. I have nothing to lose. Mrs. Bennett, you do." She turned away, moving to the window where frost painted delicate patterns on the glass. "I swore I'd never remarry. When John died, I promised—" "You promised to honor his memory," Harlow interrupted gently. "Would he want you to lose everything you built together for the sake of that promise?" The question hung between them, and Clara hated that this stranger had voiced the very thought that had tormented her all night. John had been practical above all else. He'd have seen the sense in survival, even if it meant compromise. A commotion outside drew her attention. Riders again, but many more this time. Her heart sank as she recognized not just Sheriff Wallace, but Maxwell Pierce himself, accompanied by at least 6 armed men. "They're early," she murmured. Harlow joined her at the window, leaning heavily on the wall. Pierce couldn't resist coming to gloat. Clara checked John's rifle. then tucked his pistol into her apron pocket. "Stay inside. Whatever happens, I'm not hiding while you face them alone. You can barely stand." "Then I'll sit." He grabbed a kitchen chair and dragged it near the door. "But I won't cower inside like a child." Before Clara could argue further, Pierce's voice boomed across the yard. "Mrs. Bennett, time's up. The good sheriff here needs your decision." Clara stepped onto the porch, rifle prominently displayed though not quite aimed. "The sheriff said we had 2 days. By my count, that's tomorrow." Pierce smiled, that snake smile she'd grown to loathe. "Circumstances change. Word is that Mr. Harlow here might be thinking of running. Can't have that." "Since when do you care about Mr. Harlow's whereabouts?" Clara asked. "Last I heard, you left him for dead in a blizzard." Pierce's eyes hardened. "Careful with accusations you can't prove. Widow, slander's a serious matter." Behind her, Clara heard the door open. Harlow emerged, moving carefully but standing straight. The morning sun caught his pale eyes, making them seem almost silver. "Hello, Maxwell," he said conversationally. "Surprised to see me breathing." "Nathaniel." Pierce's hand twitched toward his gun. "You're looking poorly. That's what comes of riding in storms, I suppose. Dangerous country out here." "Indeed, all sorts of accidents can happen. Bullets flying from nowhere. For instance..." Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat loudly. "Enough chit-chat. Mrs. Bennett, the town requires your answer. Marriage or exile. Choose." Clara felt the weight of all those eyes upon her. Pierce's triumphant, Wallace's impatient, the hired guns' coldly professional. Behind her, she sensed Harlow's tension, coiled despite his weakness. She began. "You need to decide now." Pierce interrupted. "The Reverend's waiting in town with the marriage certificate. Sign it today, or start packing." "That's not what was agreed." Pierce's voice overrode hers. "You harbored a man, Mrs. Bennett. A woman of loose morals has no business corrupting our community. Choose, or we'll choose for you." One of Pierce's men, a scarred brute named Haskins, dismounted and started toward the porch. Clara raised her rifle. "That's close enough." Haskins grinned, showing gold teeth. "Now, ma'am, no need for unpleasantness. Mister, Pierce is being generous, giving you a choice at all." "Generous?" Clara's temper finally snapped. "Like he was generous to the Johnsons? The O'Briens? Like he was generous to my John?" "Your husband died in an accident," Pierce said, his voice carrying a warning. "Did he?" Clara's voice rang across the yard. "Just like all the other accidents that happen to folks who won't sell?" Pierce's face darkened. "Sheriff, seems the widow's gone hysterical. Maybe she needs help packing." "I'll marry her." Harlow's words cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped forward, placing himself partially between Clara and the guns. "I'll marry her," he repeated, stronger this time. "Today, if that's what you require." Pierce's eyes narrowed. Well, the banker's boy wants to play rancher." "What I want is irrelevant," Harlow replied coolly. "You've forced the issue. We'll comply." Clara turned to stare at him, but his eyes remained fixed on Pierce. Something passed between the two men, some silent communication laden with threat and history. "Mrs. Bennett?" Sheriff Wallace prompted. "Do you agree to this marriage?" The word no burned in Clara's throat. Every fiber of her being rebelled against this forced choice, this mockery of what marriage should be. But she looked at the armed men, at Pierce's satisfied smirk, at her land stretching beyond them, land John had died for. "I agree," she said, the words tasting like ashes. Pierce clapped slowly, mockingly. "How touching! True love conquers all." His voice hardened. "Be in town by noon, both of you. Don't keep the Reverend waiting." As the riders departed, Clara sank onto the porch step, suddenly exhausted. Harlow lowered himself carefully beside her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This isn't how either of us—" "Don't!" Clara's voice was sharp. "Just don't! We'll do what we must to survive, but don't pretend this is anything more than that." They sat in silence, watching Pierce's dust cloud disappear into the distance. In a few hours, they would stand before God and the law, two strangers bound by desperation and the machinations of evil men. Clara touched her wedding ring, John's ring, one last time. "Forgive me," she whispered, not knowing if she spoke to John's memory or to herself. The sun climbed higher, marking the hours until noon, until the moment when Clara Bennett would cease to exist and Clara Harlow would be born, a name as false as the marriage that would create it. But it would keep her land. It would buy her time, and in the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, that would have to be enough. Harlow stirred beside her. "We should prepare. Town's an hour's ride, and I'll need help getting on a horse." Clara stood, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's get this over with." As she helped him to his feet, their eyes met briefly. In his pale gaze, she saw her own resignation mirrored, along with something else, a flicker of determination that matched her own. They might be forced into this marriage, but Clara sensed this was far from over. Pierce had won this battle, but the war for her land, for justice, was just beginning. The first weeks of their forced marriage passed in awkward silence and careful distance. Harlow had recovered enough to move about, though his shoulders still pained him. He'd taken to sleeping in the barn, despite Clara's protests about the cold, maintaining the fiction of propriety even within their sham union. It was during this uneasy period that Clara noticed the change in Pierce's tactics. Where before he'd been boldly aggressive, now he seemed to be waiting, watching. His men were seen around town more frequently, asking questions about the Harlow marriage, spreading whispers that it wasn't legitimate. "He's planning something," Clara said one evening as she and Harlow shared a quiet supper. They'd developed a routine of sorts, polite conversation over meals, working separately during the day, avoiding any semblance of true intimacy. Harlow nodded, pushing beans around his plate. "I've been thinking the same. The ledger. We need to get it to someone who can use it. Someone Pierce can't buy or intimidate." "Who? Every official in 3 counties is in his pocket." "There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne, James McKenna. He's investigating corruption in the territories. If we could get the evidence to him." Clara considered this. "Cheyenne's 3 days' ride in good weather. Pierce would never let us get that far." "Not together, no." Harlow met her eyes. "But he might not notice if one of us went alone." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both tense. She reached for the rifle, but Harlow stayed her hand. "Too many," he said quietly, peering through the window. "At least a dozen men." Pierce himself led the group, but this time he'd brought different companions, men in expensive suits who looked distinctly out of place on horseback. Clara recognized one, Harrison Whitmore, the territorial bank examiner. Mrs. Harlow," Pierce called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Might we come in? Mr. Whitmore here has some questions about your husband's recent activities." Clara and Harlow exchanged glances. This was new and dangerous. They had no choice but to let them in. The men crowded into the small cabin, their presence oppressive. Whitmore, a thin man with calculating eyes, produced a sheaf of papers. Mr. Harlow," he began without preamble. "There are serious discrepancies in your father's bank records. Missing funds, unauthorized transactions. Your signature appears on several suspicious documents." "My signature?" Harlow's voice was steady, but Clara saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the table edge. "Indeed, transferring funds to questionable accounts, approving loans without proper collateral." Whitmore's smile was predatory. "Your father is quite upset. He's offered a reward for information leading to your arrest." Clara's mind raced. This was Pierce's new strategy. If he couldn't force them out through social pressure, he'd use the law itself as a weapon. "Those signatures are forgeries," Harlow stated flatly. "My father knows full well." "Your father knows his son betrayed the family business," Pierce interrupted smoothly. "Went soft, started giving away money to every sob story that walked through the door. When confronted, you shot your way out of town like a common criminal." "That's a lie," Clara interjected. "Nathaniel was shot when he arrived here. I can testify." "The testimony of a wife holds little weight in court," Whitmore said dismissively. "Especially one who married so hastily. Some might say you were complicit in Mr. Harlow's schemes." The threat was clear. They weren't just after Harlow. They meant to implicate Clara as well. "What do you want?" Harlow asked quietly. Pierce's smile widened. "Justice, of course. You'll return with Mr. Whitmore to face charges. Your wife, being an innocent woman led astray, will be free to sell her ranch and start fresh elsewhere. Everyone wins." "Except for us," Clara said bitterly. "Choices have consequences," Pierce replied. "You chose to harbor a criminal. You chose to marry him. Now you must choose how this ends, with dignity, or with both of you in prison." Whitmore produced a document. "Sign this confession, Mr. Harlow. Admit to embezzlement, exonerate your wife, and things will go easier for you." Harlow reached for the paper, but Clara snatched it first, scanning rapidly. Her eyes widened. "This isn't just a confession, it's a transfer of property. It signs over my ranch to Pierce." "A small matter of compensation," Whitmore said smoothly. "For the bank's losses, you understand." "Losses that never happened," Harlow said, his voice gaining strength. "Just like the embezzlement never happened. This is all fabrication." Pierce's friendly mask finally slipped. "Prove it. Your word against mine. Your father's, the bank examiner's. Who do you think they'll believe?" The silence stretched taut. Clara's mind worked frantically, seeking a way out of this trap. Then, from outside, came an unexpected sound. Horses, many of them, and voices calling out. "Clara, you in there?" She recognized the voice. Tom O'Brien, Sam's brother. Through the window, she could see riders surrounding the house. Not Pierce's men, neighbors, the Kowalskis, the Changs, even old Weber from the German settlement. At least 20 people, all armed, all wearing grim expressions. Pierce stepped onto the porch, his hand moving to his gun. "What's this about? This is legal business." "Legal like Sam's foreclosure was legal?" Tom O'Brien asked. His rifle wasn't quite pointed at Pierce, but the threat was clear. "Legal like Ben Johnson's accident?" Mary O'Brien pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Harlow gave us time when the bank wouldn't, helped us keep our homes. We won't stand by while you railroad him." Clara felt a surge of hope. The community Pierce had terrorized for so long was finally standing together. Whitmore emerged, looking far less confident. "This is interference with territorial authority. I'll have you all arrested." "With what army?" asked Lee Chang, whose family had nearly lost their restaurant to a suspicious fire. "Sheriff Wallace seems to be busy elsewhere." Indeed, the sheriff was conspicuously absent from Pierce's group, a telling detail. Pierce's face flushed with rage. "You people don't understand what you're doing. I own this county." "No," Clara said, stepping forward. "You've stolen from this county, murdered for it, but you don't own it." She turned to address the crowd. "Nathaniel has evidence, proof of Pierce's crimes, the bank's corruption, all of it. We need to get it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne." "Over my dead body," Pierce snarled, reaching for his gun. 20 rifles swung toward him. He froze, hand hovering over his pistol. "That can be arranged," Tom O'Brien said quietly. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Then Whitmore, proving himself a coward as well as a corrupt official, backed toward his horse. "This isn't over," he warned. "The law—" "The law's coming," Harlow interrupted. "The real law. Federal marshals don't take kindly to territorial corruption." He looked at Pierce. "Your time's up. Maxwell, you just don't know it yet." Pierce's men were outnumbered and outgunned. After a tense moment, Pierce himself backed down, though his eyes promised retribution. "This isn't over," he echoed Whitmore. "You think these sodbusters can protect you forever? You think that sham marriage will hold up in court?" "It'll hold up better than your forged documents," Clara replied. As Pierce and his men rode away, the neighbors didn't disperse. Tom O'Brien dismounted, approaching Clara and Harlow. "We've been talking," he said. "What Mary said about Mr. Harlow helping, others have similar stories. The Webbers, the Kowalskis. Seems he's been quietly fixing what his father broke." Clara looked at Harlow in surprise. He shifted uncomfortably. "It was small things, nothing heroic." "Heroic enough," said Weber in his thick accent. "You gift us time when we have nothing. Now we gift you same." Li Chang nodded. "We'll help you reach Cheyenne. Take turns watching your ranch. Pierce won't catch you alone again." As the neighbors organized shifts and made plans, Clara found herself studying Harlow with new eyes. The pampered banker's son she'd expected had become something else. Someone else. The way he spoke with the farmers, respectful and direct, showed no trace of his privileged background. Later, as the crowd dispersed with promises to return, Clara and Harlow stood alone on the porch. "Why didn't you tell me," she asked, "about helping the others?" He shrugged, wincing at the movement. "Would you have believed me? Besides, I wasn't trying to be noble, just trying to sleep at night." Clara understood that. The weight of conscience could be heavier than any physical burden. "We make a good team," she said carefully. "When we're not at each other's throats." "That we do." He met her eyes. "This marriage may have started as a farce, but perhaps it doesn't have to stay one." The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Clara wasn't ready to answer. Not yet, but for the first time since that forced ceremony, she didn't immediately reject the possibility. "First, we survive," she said. "Then we see what's left to build on." Harlow nodded, understanding in his pale eyes. "First, we survive." As night fell, Clara found herself thinking not of the past but of the future. The battle with Pierce was far from over, but they were no longer fighting alone, and the man she'd been forced to marry was proving to be far more than she'd expected. Perhaps there was hope yet, even in the harsh land of Wyoming Territory. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the confrontation with Pierce. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of cattle bellowing in terror. She grabbed John's rifle and rushed outside, Harlow close behind with his pistol drawn. The barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. Dark figures moved among the chaos. Pierce's men, driving her cattle toward the open range while others stood guard with rifles. "The horses!" Clara shouted, starting toward the barn, but Harlow caught her arm. "It's a trap! Look!" He pointed to the rifle barrels glinting from strategic positions. "They're waiting for us to rush in." As if to confirm his words, a shot rang out, splintering the porch rail inches from Clara's hand. They dove back inside as more bullets peppered the cabin walls. "So much for the neighbors' protection," Clara said bitterly, checking her ammunition. "They probably hit the O'Briens and Webbers first, kept them busy." Harlow peered through a gap in the window boards. "I count at least 8 men, plus whoever's with the cattle." Clara's heart sank. They were outnumbered 4-1, trapped in the cabin while her livelihood burned outside. This was Pierce's final play. If he couldn't force them out legally, he'd simply destroy everything they had to protect. "There," Harlow pointed. "Pierce himself, by the corral." Clara saw him, sitting his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. Even at this distance, she could see his satisfied smile. "Harlow," Pierce's voice carried over the crackling flames. "You've got one chance. Come out, both of you, and I might let the widow keep her life, if not her land." "Go to hell, Pierce," Clara shouted back. Pierce laughed. "Spirited to the end. Your husband was the same way, right before his accident." The casual admission of John's murder sent rage flooding through Clara. She raised her rifle, but Harlow pushed the barrel down. "Not yet. We need to be smart." He glanced around the cabin, his mind clearly working. "The root cellar? Does it connect to the house?" "Yes, but—" Clara stopped, understanding. "The old tunnel John dug, it comes out behind the chicken coop. Can you make it to the Changs' place? Get help?" "I'm not leaving you here alone." "Clara." His use of her first name stopped her. "One of us needs to survive this, to make sure the truth gets out. The ledger is hidden in the root cellar," Clara finished, "under the preserves." They shared a long look, understanding passing between them. In these weeks of forced partnership, they'd developed an unspoken communication, a trust born of necessity that had grown into something deeper. "Together," Clara said firmly. "We go together or not at all." Before Harlow could argue, the situation changed. New gunfire erupted, but not aimed at the cabin. Shouts of alarm came from Pierce's men as riders appeared on the horizon, not just neighbors, but men in federal badges. "The Marshal!" Harlow breathed. "McKenna made it in time." Tom O'Brien had ridden hard for Cheyenne the night before, carrying copies of the most damning documents. Clara had doubted he'd find help in time, but apparently, Marshal McKenna had already been investigating Pierce's operation. The battle erupted in earnest. Pierce's men, caught between the cabin and the federal posse, scattered in confusion. Clara and Harlow took advantage, laying down covering fire from the windows. "The barn!" Clara cried out as a section of roof collapsed. 3 horses burst from the flames, including Duchess, John's mare that Clara had refused to sell despite offers. The animals fled in terror, but at least they lived. The federal marshals were efficient and well-trained. Within minutes, they had Pierce's men surrendering or fleeing. Pierce himself tried to escape, spurring his horse toward the hills, but Marshal McKenna, a grizzled veteran with eyes like flint, brought him down with a single shot that knocked him from the saddle. As the smoke cleared and the sun climbed higher, the full extent of the damage became clear. The barn was a total loss, still smoldering despite bucket brigades from arriving neighbors. Half the cattle were scattered to the winds, but the house stood intact. And more importantly, Clara and Harlow lived. Marshal McKenna approached them, tipping his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Harlow, sorry we couldn't arrive sooner." "You arrived in time," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That's what matters." "Tom O'Brien filled me in on the situation. We've been tracking Pierce's operation for months, but couldn't get anyone local to testify." He looked at Harlow. "Your evidence made the difference, though I understand there's more." Clara retrieved the original ledger from its hiding place, handling it like the precious thing it was. McKenna whistled low as he flipped through the pages. "This will put away half the territorial government. Your father, too, I'm afraid." He added to Harlow. "I know," Harlow said quietly. "He made his choices." As the marshals led Pierce away in irons, he passed close to Clara and Harlow. His expensive clothes were torn and dusty, his arrogant face marred by dirt and defeat, but his eyes still held venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? I have friends, influence—" "You have a federal prison cell," McKenna interrupted, "and about 20 years to think about what you've done." As Pierce was dragged away, still making threats, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The man who'd orchestrated John's death, who'd terrorized the county for years, was finished. But victory came with a price. Standing amid the wreckage of her barn, watching neighbors arrive to help fight the dying fires, Clara felt the full impact of what they'd endured. She swayed on her feet, exhaustion and delayed reaction hitting her all at once. Harlow's arm came around her waist, steady and sure. "Easy, it's over now." "Is it?" Clara looked up at him, seeing her own weariness reflected in his pale eyes. "The barn's gone. Half my cattle, even with Pierce locked away. I don't know if I can rebuild." Harlow corrected gently. "We can rebuild, if you'll have me." The question hung between them, no longer about legal necessity, but something deeper. Clara thought of the man she'd first found in the snow, privileged, wounded, a stranger. Now she saw someone who'd stood beside her against impossible odds, who'd risked everything for justice, who'd proven himself in ways that mattered. "The marriage was forced," she said carefully. "You could seek annulment now. Go back east. Start over where Pierce's friends can't reach you. Is that what you want?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the neighbors form bucket brigades, seeing the community that had rallied to their defense. Tom O'Brien caught her eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of debts repaid and friendships forged in fire. "No," she admitted. "It's not what I want." Harlow's arm tightened around her. "Then we rebuild, together, make something better from the ashes." Sheriff Wallace arrived then, late as always, blustering about jurisdiction and proper procedures. McKenna shut him down with a few terse words and a warrant for his arrest. Pierce had named names in his desperation, and the sheriff's was prominent among them. As the day wore on, the true extent of their victory became clear. With the evidence from the ledger, dozens of families would reclaim their stolen lands. The bank's fraudulent practices would be exposed, its assets distributed to those who'd been cheated. It wouldn't bring back the dead or undo years of suffering, but it was justice of a sort. That evening, as neighbors pitched in to create temporary shelter for the surviving livestock, Clara stood with Harlow watching the sunset paint the sky crimson and gold. The barn skeleton still smoldered, but already there was talk of a barn raising, the community coming together to rebuild what violence had destroyed. "I need to tell you something," Clara said, "about John, about why I was so set against remarrying. You don't owe me explanations." "Yes, I do. If we're to make this real, you should know." She took a breath. "John was everything to me. When he died, I thought my heart died with him. I couldn't imagine feeling that way again. Couldn't imagine allowing anyone else into that space." "And now?" Clara turned to face him fully. "Now I know the heart has room for more than one love. Different loves, maybe, but no less real." She touched his face gently, feeling the stubble and the warmth beneath. "What we have isn't what John and I had, but it's ours, built from fire and struggle and choice. That makes it precious too." Harlow caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "I came here a broken man running from responsibility. You gave me purpose, something worth fighting for. I can't promise to replace what you've lost, but I can promise to stand beside you, whatever comes." "That's enough," Clara said. "That's more than enough." As darkness fell and lanterns bloomed like fireflies among the workers, Clara felt a different kind of warmth spreading through her chest. Not the young, innocent love she'd known with John, but something tested and true, forged in adversity and chosen in freedom. The barn was gone, but they would build another. The cattle were scattered, but they would gather them. And the marriage that had begun as a trap had become a foundation for something new and strong and entirely their own. Tomorrow would bring challenges, trials, rebuilding, the slow work of healing a wounded community. But tonight, standing in the circle of Harlow's arms while their neighbors sang working songs and shared what they had, Clara allowed herself to believe in second chances and unexpected blessings. The wolves had been driven off, the winter was ending, and spring, with all its promise of renewal, was finally coming to the Wyoming territory. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with an artist's touch. The hills shed their white shrouds for green. Wildflowers dotted the meadows like scattered jewels, and the air carried the sweet scent of new grass and possibility. Clara stood in the doorway of the new barn, admiring the solid construction. The barn raising had brought the entire county together. 3 days of hard work and shared meals that had done more to heal the community than any court verdict could. Where Pierce's reign had divided them with fear and suspicion, adversity had forged them into something stronger. "The last of the cattle are in the upper pasture," Harlow said, joining her. His hands were calloused now, his skin bronzed from working under the sun. The transformation from banker's son to rancher hadn't been easy. She'd seen him struggle with rope burns and sore muscles, but he'd never complained, never suggested they hire help they couldn't afford. "All 40 head accounted for?" Clara asked. 42, actually. The Henderson twins wandered back yesterday with 2 calves in tow. Clara smiled. Those ornery heifers had vanished during Pierce's attack, and she'd written them off as lost. But the land had a way of returning what belonged to it, in time. "Letter came while you were out," she said, producing an envelope from her apron pocket. "From Cheyenne." Harlow's expression grew guarded. Letters from the city rarely brought good news. He opened it slowly, and Clara watched his face change as he read. "My father's dead," he said quietly. "Heart gave out during the trial." Clara touched his arm gently. Despite everything, she knew the news would pain him. Family was family, even when it disappointed you. "There's more," Harlow continued. "The bank's assets are being distributed among the victims of the fraud, as the court ordered. But apparently, Father left a personal bequest to me. After disowning you? He wrote a new will the night before he died, left me enough to—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Enough to ensure we never want for anything, and a letter." He handed her the second page, his father's spidery handwriting covering expensive paper. "Nathaniel, I spent my life building an empire on others' misfortune, telling myself it was business, not personal, but watching that empire crumble, seeing the faces of those I'd wronged in court, I finally understood what you tried to tell me. A man's legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives he touches. I touched many lives, all for the worse. You chose differently. You chose honor over profit, justice over family. I hated you for it then. I thank you for it now. Use this money to build something better than I ever could. Your mother would be proud. Father." Clara read it twice, feeling the weight of redemption in those words. He found his conscience at the end. "Too late to matter," Harlow said, but without bitterness. "It always matters," Clara disagreed. "Every choice toward good matters, even the last ones." They stood quietly for a moment, watching the sun climb higher over their land. Their land. The word still felt new to Clara, but she was learning to think in terms of we instead of I. "There's something I need to do," she said finally. "Something I've been putting off." Harlow understood immediately. "John's grave." Clara nodded. She hadn't visited the small cemetery on the hill since the forced marriage, unable to face that quiet stone with another man's ring on her finger. But spring was a time for new beginnings, and that meant making peace with the past. They rode together to the cemetery. Wildflowers gathered from the meadow in Clara's arms. John's grave stood slightly apart, the simple stone marker reading, "John Bennett, beloved husband, 1,862 to 1,885 inches." Clara knelt, arranging the flowers carefully. "Hello, John," she said softly. "I'm sorry I haven't come sooner. I was afraid you'd think I'd betrayed you, forgotten you, but I think you'd understand. You always said I was too stubborn to quit, too practical to let sentiment override sense. Well, I've been both stubborn and practical." She felt Harlow standing respectfully back, giving her space for this private moment. "I found a good man, John, different from you. where you were gentle. He's fierce, where you were content with our small corner of the world. He dreams of making it bigger, better, but he's kind and brave, and he makes me laugh when I forget I know how." She touched the stone gently. "I'll always love you. You taught me what love could be, but I'm not meant to be alone, and I think you knew that. I think that's why you made me promise to be happy, not just to survive." Clara stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, from her pocket. She withdrew John's wedding ring, the one she'd worn on a chain since marrying Harlow. She kissed it once, then placed it at the base of the stone. "Rest easy, my first love. I'll tend our land and live our dreams, just with a different partner for the journey." When she turned, she found Harlow waiting with tears on his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for having a heart," Clara said, taking his hand. "It's one of the things I love about you." The word hung between them. Love. They'd danced around it for weeks, their relationship deepening from forced partnership to genuine affection, but neither had spoken it aloud. "Clara," Harlow began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "I know. Me too. We don't need words for what we've built." They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, the silence comfortable and full, as they crested the rise above their valley. Clara pulled up short, marveling at the view. The new barn stood proud and strong. Smoke rose from their chimney, and cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures. It was the same view she'd seen 1,000 times, yet somehow entirely new. "What are you thinking?" Harlow asked. "That I'm home," Clara said simply, truly home, for the first time since John died, not just existing in a place, but living in it. That evening, they held a celebration, not grand or formal, just neighbors gathering to mark the end of winter and the promise of spring. The O'Briens brought their fiddle, the Changs their special dumplings, the Webbers their strong beer. Music and laughter filled the night as children chased fireflies and adults danced under the stars. Clara found herself in Harlow's arms for a waltz, moving to the fiddle's sweet melody. Around them, other couples swayed, some married 50 years, some newly courting, all part of the tapestry of community they'd helped weave. "No regrets?" Harlow asked softly. Clara considered the question seriously. The path that had brought them together was paved with pain. John's death, Pierce's cruelty, the forced marriage that had seemed like the end of her independence. But that same path had led to this moment, this life, this unexpected joy. "No regrets," she confirmed. "The past shapes us but doesn't define us. We are who we choose to be, moment by moment." "Then who do you choose to be tonight?" Clara smiled, pulling him closer. "Clara Harlow, rancher, wife, survivor, and very much in love with her impossible husband." He spun her around, making her laugh like a young girl. "Impossible, I prefer improbable. Like this whole story, a widow and a banker's son taking on the most powerful man in the territory and winning." "Stories have to make sense," Clara said. "Life just has to be lived." As the music played on and the stars wheeled overhead, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. A winter storm, a dying stranger, a choice between conscience and safety that had changed everything. She'd saved Harlow's life that night, but in truth, they'd saved each other. The new barn stood strong against the night sky, built by community hands and shared purpose. The cattle lowed contentedly in the pastures, the spring grass rich and nourishing. And in the small ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness, two souls who'd found each other against all odds were building a future together. Pierce was gone, serving his sentence in federal prison. The corrupt officials who'd enabled him had been replaced by honest men. The families he'd displaced were returning to their lands, rebuilding their lives. Justice had prevailed. Imperfectly, perhaps, but more completely than anyone had dared hope. But more than justice, there was renewal. In the laughter of neighbors, the promise of good harvests, the simple pleasure of a shared meal and a warm bed, in the knowledge that sometimes the very worst circumstances could lead to the very best outcomes. As the celebration wound down and neighbors began their journeys home, Clara and Harlow stood on their porch, watching lanterns disappear into the darkness like stars returning to heaven. "What now?" Harlow asked. Clara leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid presence of him, the reliability she'd come to depend on. "Now we live. We work the land, raise our cattle, help our neighbors. We build something worth leaving behind. Together? Always together." The spring breeze carried the scent of wild roses and new beginnings. Inside the house, the fire crackled warmly, waiting to welcome them home. And somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang its liquid song, a benediction on all that had been overcome and all that was yet to come. Clara Bennett had begun this winter as a widow, alone and besieged. She ended it as Clara Harlow, partnered and victorious. The transformation hadn't been easy or expected, but the best things in life rarely were. As she followed her husband inside, closing the door on the night and the past alike, she knew with bone-deep certainty that John would approve. Love wasn't diminished by being shared. It was multiplied, spreading like spring flowers across a landscape that had known too much winter. The story that had begun with death and storm had found its ending in life and sunshine, and in the Wyoming Territory, where happy endings were as rare as gentle winters. That was nothing short of a miracle.